All right. Well, thank you for the songs this morning. We are returning to Matthew chapter 25. In our study through the Gospel of Matthew, this is message number 65 in that series, entitled The Kingdom Judgment. And we'll be looking at the end of this chapter, verses 31 to 46. And I'm going to read verses 31 to 33 as we get started. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations. And he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. So chapters 23 to 25 in Matthew are the fifth and the final long teaching section in this gospel. And Matthew has carefully placed and arranged his gospel account. Of course, it's sort of roughly chronological with the life and ministry of Jesus, but these teaching sections form what we might think of as certain structural points in the book. They are supportive. And this last teaching section consists of two main parts. And the 12 apostles were with Jesus. They were present for all of this, but the first part was a public teaching that was given at the temple, and that's all of chapter 23. And the second part was given privately to his disciples on the Mount of Olives, and that's chapters 24 and 25. And this part of the teaching that we are currently in and have come to the end of was given in response to the apostles' question. They asked, "When shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the age?" And you have to remember that just before Jesus left the temple, his final statements there were prophesying the desolation of Jerusalem. Jesus described to them, in answer to their question, a sequence of events that included tribulation, his coming, and the end of the age. All of these events, Jesus indicated, are unmistakable. They are unique events in the entire history of the world. And so no one is to be deceived about that time, thinking that this is something different than what it is written or described, thinking that it's something that's already passed or something that's presently occurring or occurring over a long time. No, it's a very short time. Very connected sequential events, then this, then this, then this. So they're all connected. They all happen in a succession from the beginning of the birth pains to the second coming of Christ, all in this time at the end of the age. So as Jesus came near to the close of this teaching, he gave four parables that all center around the very important fact that no one knows the day or the hour when this age will end with all of these events. And obviously, the grand climax of that being the second coming of Jesus Christ. He emphasized the importance of that fact, that you don't know. And not only do we not know, but based on what Jesus is saying, we cannot know. We cannot know the day or the hour. We cannot know the time when these things will happen. And he gave a warning, particularly through these parables, sort of from two different perspectives. One of those being that this unknown time is going to come much sooner than what some people think. Some people may think that they have all the time in the world, and they do not. And for others, this end of the age is going to be seemingly very long delayed. Now, the parables that Jesus told are consistent with the other parables in Matthew. We've been noting this as we've been going along in this gospel. They involve some sort of time of waiting, some sort of delay. There's a departing and a returning of some significant person. There's a returning after a time that means judgment. The judgment means a gathering and a separating of the evil and the just, or the good and the bad. And the just are rewarded and the evil are punished. And that's typically by them being cast out in some way, often to fire, to darkness, to weeping and gnashing of teeth. While the just, on the other hand, are rewarded and are promoted according to their faithfulness. And this has been very consistent throughout the parables, and at least adhering to some of these things in all these parables. Now, the message that Jesus gave them is an urgent message to be ready. The end of the age and the coming of Christ means judgment. Well, this brings us to the last part of this teaching on the Mount of Olives. And this last part here from verse 31 down through verse 46. And so, consistent with Old Testament prophecies, consistent with the parables of Jesus, and also consistent with many plain statements that Jesus has made to this point, this age ends with tribulation and his coming and judgment. So Jesus here describes a scene when he comes to the earth in glory, sits on his throne as king, and judges the nations by their works toward Israel, to enter into his kingdom or to be cast out and cut off from the earth. So as we look at this last part, we have two main parts we want to divide it into. Verses 31 to 40, where Jesus speaks about those on his right hand, and in verses 41 to 46, primarily speaking of those on the left hand. So we'll begin with the right hand and verse number 31. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory. So the disciples began their question back in the first part of chapter 24, asking about when these things will take place. And so Jesus here referred to when the Son of Man shall come and what will happen then. In other words, Jesus puts this again, it's a sequence. It is closely connected events. The Son of Man will come, and then something is going to happen, which is this judgment that he is describing at the end of this chapter. Now, he previously revealed that the Son of Man will come immediately after the tribulation of those days. That's back in chapter 24, verses 29 to 31. That tribulation of those days is what he referred to as great tribulation, happening after the abomination of desolation in the middle of Daniel's 70th week, back in chapter 24 and verse number 21. Well, because these events are so connected, and because they happen in succession over a short, determined amount of time, he said that when they begin, his coming will be very near, and that will be known. Now, Jesus explicitly identified himself as the Son of Man. If you read most of the time, most of the references when Jesus talks about the Son of Man, he's talking in the third person. Notice what he says here. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then he shall sit on the throne of his glory. And of course, he's giving reference to this Son of Man that was prophesied to receive the kingdom and to come to the earth and exercise dominion in an everlasting kingdom in Daniel chapter number 7 in particular, and that's where the roots of this title comes from. But there was one place in particular where Jesus did not speak of the Son of Man in the third person, but in fact in Matthew chapter 16 and verse number 13, remember when he asked his disciples, "Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" He clearly identified himself as this Son of Man that he is speaking of. And he also went on in chapter 16 to speak very plainly about his coming as the Son of Man. So in verses 27 and 28 in Matthew 16, Jesus said, "For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he shall reward every man according to his works. Verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Some. Notice, and of course this was right prior to the Mount of Transfiguration when Peter and James and John would see the appearance of the Son of Man in his kingdom glory for just a brief moment there on the Mount of Transfiguration. They got just a brief glimpse into what this coming of the Son of Man was going to look like. Jesus also referred to this coming very plainly, Matthew chapter 19 and verse number 28. And Jesus said unto them, Verily I say unto you that ye which have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit in the throne of his glory, ye also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, Jesus has obviously referred to his coming in the parables, but these that I'm reading here, these are plain statements. These are plain prophecies about the coming of the Son of Man. And you notice that his coming means the coming of his kingdom. It means judgment, and it also means restoration for Israel, as has been prophesied in places like Isaiah chapter 9 and verse number 7. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. Jeremiah wrote about this time, Jeremiah chapter 33, verses 15 and 16. In those days and at that time will I cause the branch of righteousness to grow up unto David, and he shall execute judgment and righteousness in the land. In those days shall Judah be saved, and Jerusalem shall dwell safely. And this is the name wherewith she shall be called the Lord our righteousness. So this is what Jesus is talking about. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, all the holy angels with him, and he will sit upon the throne of his glory when that happens. Now his coming, as he indicates here, it is to sit upon this throne of his glory, which is also the throne of David. In a little bit, in just a few verses, verse 34, in fact, Jesus is going to identify himself as king. He will sit as king on the throne of his glory. And this is exactly what the angel Gabriel prophesied to Mary concerning Jesus, which is the same angel, by the way, who prophesied to Daniel some centuries earlier. Luke chapter 1, verses 32 and 33. He, that's Jesus, shall be great and shall be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David, and he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. Once again, this same Son of Man, this same coming, this same kingdom, this same throne prophesied in the Old Testament and what we are reading about here. So if you want to know, well, when does the kingdom come? When does the kingdom begin? It begins right here. When the Son of Man comes in power and in great glory and sits upon the throne of his father David in Jerusalem, in glory, in power, reigning and ruling, is when the kingdom begins. Verses 32 and 33. And before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. So the king will sit on his throne, and he will sit for judgment. We're told that the nations will be gathered before him and separated for judgment. And this is the exact end of the age scene that is anticipated by the parables. Think about the wheat and the tares. Think about the parable of the net. At the wheat and the tares, there's a great harvest and a gathering. And then there's a dividing out of the wheat. There's a separating of the wheat from the tares. In the parable of the net, there's a great gathering with the net from the boat, and then come to the shore and sit down, and there's a separating of the good fish from the bad. This is the exact scene Jesus was describing in those parables. This is also prophesied very plainly in the Old Testament in places like Joel chapter number 3. I'm going to read a few verses here, verses 1 and 2. For behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and will bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. And there's some descriptions that happen after this of different things that they've done. Skip down to verses 12 to 17. Let the heathen, the nations, the Goyim, be wakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there will I sit to judge all the heathen, all the nations round about. Put ye in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, get you down, for the press is full, the fats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon shall be darkened, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. The Lord also shall roar out of Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall shake, but the Lord will be the hope of his people and the strength of the children of Israel. So shall ye know that I am the Lord your God, dwelling in Zion, my holy mountain. Then shall Jerusalem be holy, and there shall no strangers pass through her anymore. Verse 13 there in Joel 3 talked about the sickle and the harvest and the winepress. Sometimes when we come to the parables of Jesus, and that might be some of the most popular parts of the Gospels, the parables. People really love the parables and love to make a whole lot of things out of the parables. But where do those parables come from? What are they connected to? You say, well, it's an agrarian society, and so Jesus just simply told stories that would be understandable to his first century rural audience, and they weren't complicated or difficult. And that is true, but they're also familiar to them for another reason. They're familiar to them because they're also connected to what has been prophesied before. So here in Joel 3:13, the sickle and the harvest, just like Jesus spoke about in the wheat and the tares in chapter 13. The winepress, which also featured in the parable of the tenants in the vineyard reference in Matthew chapter 21. Of course, the winepress also features in other prophecies about this time, like Isaiah chapter 63, verses 1 to 6, and even Revelation and the coming of the Lord in Revelation 19, in verses 11 to 16. Now, Matthew said here, the words of Jesus, that all nations would be gathered before him. The Greek phrase, in fact, is pantata ethne. Always, that phrase is used of the people group nations living on the earth. So what is the point? This gathering is of the remaining living nations at the coming of Jesus. They will be gathered before the King on his throne. Verse 33 says, and he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. So he will separate the sheep from the goats. The sheep here obviously corresponding to the righteous among the nations, the Gentile nations, while the goats correspond to the wicked among those same nations. So this is a judgment of the Gentile nations. This is not a judgment of Israel. And we'll see that a little more plainly in just a moment. Verse 34, then shall the king say unto them on his right hand, he's separated them, then shall he say, come ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Well, to inherit is to receive, to take possession of the portion that is due to one as an heir. And the inheritance here is entering the kingdom on earth. Now, he makes this reference to the foundation of the world, which is a reference to the creation. He says that the kingdom was prepared or has been prepared from before the creation, meaning that God's purpose for this creation, before he ever created it, is for the earth to be inhabited by mankind and ruled by mankind through the son of Adam. Now, Jesus here again clearly identifies himself as the king. And this is the first time that he has done so in Matthew's gospel. Look at verses 35 and 36. For I was an hungered, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came unto me. Now, Jesus is here enumerating certain works of righteousness. And when you look at these works that Jesus is speaking about, you see how that they are perfectly consistent with what James described as true religion and living faith in places like James chapter 1, verse 27, James chapter 2, verses 15 to 17, or even the God-given love that John describes in 1 John chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. And so just as it is in the book of James, what we're seeing here, these are not works for salvation. These are not works that are earning salvation. These are the fruit of salvation. In other words, these evidences mark the true believers in Jesus Christ. Notice what they say in verses 37 to 39. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered and fed thee, or thirsty and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger and took thee in, or naked and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick or in prison and came unto thee? So the righteous are actually surprised by the king's judgment. As he makes this statement to these nations that have been gathered and separated according to righteous and unrighteous, they can't think of having done these things. In other words, what he's saying is, or what we can see that they're saying, that they haven't done these sort of deliberate acts of service to Christ. Now that might seem shocking, it might seem surprising for us to read, but what it shows us is that these works that Jesus says they have done were not done by them to be seen, to be praised, or even to gain future reward. These works of compassion that Jesus is describing were simply the natural and the true fruit of faith and love from a new heart during the most dangerous and troublesome time the earth will ever know, in particular, that we refer to as the tribulation. Verse 40, and the king shall answer and say unto them, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. King Jesus will then reveal that they did these things to his brothers, and so they did it to him. But who are his brothers? Well, Jesus also plainly identified them when, after he had condemned that generation of Israel for their unbelief, he pointed to his apostles as his true brothers who did the will of his Father. This is in Matthew chapter 12. The apostles were, of course, the faithful remnant of that generation of Israel. They were the true family of the Messiah rather than the unbelieving children of Jacob who will be cast out. So his brothers at his coming refers to the believing remnant of Israel. You have to recall that at this time, you will have these of the nations who are yet alive after the coming, after all of the things that have taken place. You have these of the nations who are yet alive, and then you also have those of Israel. But who of Israel is alive on the earth at this point? It is the believing remnant. Why? Because at this point, all of the wicked of Israel and unbelieving have been cut off and have been destroyed in the day of the Lord. And the remnant Israel that is there will be converted and believe in him. This is prophesied in places like Zechariah chapter 13, verses 7 to 9. And this is what Paul wrote about when he said in Romans 11, verses 26 and 27, that all Israel shall be saved. Well, this is it. All Israel that are alive on the earth at this time are all saved. They are all believers. And they are also the ones by whom the nations are being judged, just as Joel prophesied as well as in other places. Now, those of Israel, of course, that remnant was gathered at the coming of Jesus in the clouds by his angels, chapter 24 and verse number 31. They were gathered to this judgment. The nations then are gathered. And of course, recall that Joel said in Joel chapter 3 and verse number 1 that we read a few moments ago, that this is a time of restoration for Judah, for Jerusalem. Verse number 41, as we start now the second part, the left hand. Then shall he say also unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. So then Jesus will pronounce judgment on the unbelieving. They are commanded to depart, or they will be cast out into everlasting, unending fire that awaits the devil and the fallen angels. Verses 42 and 43, For I was an hungered, and you gave me no meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you took me not in. Naked, and you clothed me not. Sick and in prison, and you visited me not. In other words, he enumerates the same works that he had spoken of in terms of those that were righteous among the nations. The unrighteous among the nations have not these works. They did not do these things. They didn't show the compassion and love that he referred to the righteous among the nations. Verse 44, Then shall they answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee an hungered or athirst or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison, and did not minister unto thee? So likewise, they're surprised by the Lord's judgment. They're surprised by the king's judgment. And really they're giving something of a protest here. They're asking, when did this happen? When were we presented with opportunities to do such things to you, for you, and we neglected or refrained to do them? And in verse 45, Then shall he answer them, saying, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me. So Jesus will answer that they didn't do it to his least brethren. This is the least of the remnant of Israel at the end of the age. Just as prophesied in the Old Testament, the nations will be judged for their treatment of Israel, and especially the believing remnant during that time of tribulation. And then it ends with verse 46, And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal. Now, Jesus explained that the wicked will go away into everlasting or perpetual punishment. It's punishment without end. And the righteous will go into perpetual reward, and particularly life eternal. So we can see that this actually fulfills what Jesus spoke about previously back in chapter 24, verses 40 and 41, when he spoke about the one being taken and the other being left, one being taken in judgment and the other being left to enter into that reward. Now, those who enter into this kingdom after this kingdom judgment, when the kingdom is established, they will do so in their mortal bodies. They will live under the kingdom rule of King Jesus. They will live in that time that's described in places like the prophet Isaiah, as he spoke about, the child will die at 100 years old, and there will be a time of peace and prosperity, and the reapers and the planters will overtake one another, and so on. All of these things that will happen, the curse will be lifted off of the earth, and this kingdom that will particularly endure for 1,000 years until the final time of the end and the final judgment that will follow after that. Now, this message of judgment and readiness emphasizes to us that there's a finality to judgment. In other words, Jesus is bringing this out here as he points to this perpetual punishment or life. If you think back to the wise and the foolish virgins, once the bridegroom came and they entered in and the gate is shut, then that is the end. In other words, there's no more time for those foolish, those that are left out, those that are cast out. There's no more time. It's final at that point in that sense. Well, what that means is, even as we sit here reading this today, 2,000 years after it was written, recognizing that this hasn't happened yet, it is still somewhere in our future, maybe sooner, maybe later. We just do not know when these things are going to come. So as we sit here even today, reading about this time of judgment, thinking about the finality that judgment brings, that tells us that now is the time to think about Jesus Christ. Now is the time to think about your soul. Now is the time to think about this word of the gospel that is been preached to you. Think about who Jesus is. Think about what it is that Jesus said. Think about what it is that Jesus has done. Think about what he has yet promised to do, just like this time of judgment. One way or another, even though Jesus has talked about time, he's talked about delays, and delays that seem to be much longer than anticipated. But one way or another, time does run out for everyone. It does. So the question for us to face is, why wait? Why delay? Do you delay repentance? Do you delay faith in Jesus Christ? Why would you delay? Now is the time. As it's put in other places, today is the day of salvation. So there is an urgency when we read a message like this, that today is the day to turn from your sins, to trust in Jesus Christ. He is the King of glory. He is coming again. And he will save you and deliver you to his kingdom and eternal life with him if you believe in him. And that time is now. Don't put it off for another later time, because that time doesn't go on forever. It does come to an end. All right, that's all of our message for this morning. We will close with a hymn.